Gravity is one of the universe's most important fundamental forces. I mean, it dominates every moment of our experience here on planet Earth. It keeps us close to the ground, gives our muscles something to work against. But you don't have to be an all-star athlete like LeBron James and Serena Williams to take advantage of gravity. We regular folks use it in our everyday lives too. When we're making coffee, driving cars, cooking dinner. Have you ever thought about how difficult it would be to make a meal in space? If you're chopping vegetables, you better make sure every onion slice is attached to that cutting board. Boiling water, do not forget the lid. How in the world would you even attempt to make pizza or sushi without gravity? And what else in your life would change? Like your job?
I'm a pharmacist, so I would have a bunch of pills flying around in space, which I don't think would be a good time, really.
I'm a fundraiser, so I technically don't need gravity, I just need money.
Money's like gravity, you don't think about it till you don't have any.
I'm a teacher, so that'd be pretty cool in zero gravity.
I could not work with things floating around. I would lose my mind.
I've always said you take gravity for granted, right? Just like you take oxygen for granted. Without it, it's a far different ballgame.
Bottom line, we are lucky to have gravity here on Earth, and it's about time we all stop taking it for granted. From the Stowers Institute for Medical Research and KCUR studios in Kansas City, this is Seeking a Scientist, a podcast where science fiction meets reality. I'm Dr. Kate Bieberdorf, aka Kate the Chemist, and since the start of space exploration, over 600 astronauts have successfully reached Earth's orbit. But less than half of them have spent the night on the International Space Station. The average stay on the ISS is about 6 months, but this past September, 2 cosmonauts, aka Russian astronauts, broke the record with 374 consecutive days and nights up in space.
And the first crew member, likely Oleg Kononenko, the Soyuz commander, being helped out of the center seat. And there he is. 374 days in space on this flight, waving to the crowd.
Oleg Kononenko and Nikolai Chub are a perfect case study. What is it really like to live without gravity, floating in space for more than a year?
Gravity can cross the dimensions. Space, the final frontier.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
I do not think you realize the gravity of your situation.
On the contrary, gravity is foremost on my mind.
Oleg Kononenko now holds the record for the most time spent in space, 1,111 days. That's over 3 years of his life without gravity. He's accomplished this great feat by participating in 5 different stays on the ISS, and since living without gravity really messes up your systems, he's basically donating his living body to science, which got me thinking. What's it like doing all these science experiments in space without gravity? Are there any long-term health effects of spending so much time away from Earth? And how could this all be connected to an astronaut's potential 21-month journey to Mars? Someone who has some really special insight on this whole topic is Stanford-trained microbiologist and NASA astronaut Kate Rubins. Besides having the coolest name ever, she's spent a total of 300 days in space. And fun fact, she was the first person to sequence DNA on the ISS. Were you one of the kids who wanted to be an astronaut when you were growing up?
I was, yeah. Like you ask a kid, what do you want to do when you grow up? And of course, I'm 5 and I'm like, well, I want to be an astronaut, a biologist, and a geologist. All 3 things simultaneously because it's no problem to have 3 careers. It was pointed out to me by some really well-meaning people that very few people actually become astronauts, and so that I should have a plan B. You know, not like you can't be an astronaut, but like if that doesn't work out, what else are you going to do with your life?
So Kate set her dream of being an astronaut aside and pursued her interest in virology through her undergraduate research on HIV-1 integration at the University of California, San Diego. At the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, she developed the first model of the smallpox infection. And shortly thereafter, at the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research, she ran a lab investigating viral diseases like Ebola, Marburg, and Lassa fever, primarily because of their prominence in Central and West Africa. It was there, at MIT, where she was working on a grant application with a friend, struggling with it, really, when she realized that NASA was hiring.
We're like, this is going terribly. We're never going to get funded. And so we were doing things to distract ourselves. And she was looking at jobs online because she thought we were doing so terribly at this grant. And so she found usajobs.gov. And she's like, isn't this the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen, that they post applications to be an astronaut on usajobs.gov because it's a federal job? And I was like, that is completely ridiculous, but they're hiring. So I put in my astronaut application. And I really did think, they don't have much of a call for biologists. I just thought it was a very, very slim possibility, but you never know unless you apply.
So she applied and she got it.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff.
Well, she was hired on as a candidate by NASA, and for several years, she went through all the initial training, like learning the engineering of the space station and all of its intricate systems.
Because if anything malfunctions, we have all the world's experts in mission control down at Johnson Space Center, but we're the hands. And so we train things where maybe the crew would need to react really quickly. We don't have time to have a consultation with the ground. Like, you've got a fire, you need to act immediately. And so we train for those kinds of emergencies. We get to learn cool things like geology and space science. We then also start working on what we call our operational skills. And so that means things like learning how to do a spacewalk, and that's in our giant pool underwater. Learning how to fly the robotic arm and manipulate that robotic arm.
The Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory is basically a 40-foot deep pool that is about 200 feet long and 100 feet wide. It's filled with millions of gallons of water and staffed by professional divers, of course. It's a relatively safe place where NASA can manipulate buoyancy to provide our astronauts with mock environments of altered gravity. And they don't just stick to the ground. They put the astronaut trainees in the air, too.
We use T-38s, which are some really high-performance jet aircraft. The Air Force uses those to train their pilots. So we get in that even if you haven't flown before, to learn a lot about crew communication and coordination. And it's important to put the astronauts in something that ultimately is pretty dangerous and could kill you. So flying a high-performance jet aircraft or being 40 feet underwater in a spacesuit, we don't want to make it too dangerous, right? You don't want to kill people in training, but you have to be in that real situation because you don't know how you're going to respond when you're in space. There's nobody else in space that's going to float in and come and help you.
All that training prepares astronauts like Kate to be able to take on challenges in the moment in a calm way. Their first obstacle is learning how to maneuver in microgravity.
Okay, don't get me started on gravity.
You don't believe in gravity?
Well, it's not so much that, I don't believe in it. It's just, I don't know, lately I get the feeling that I'm not so much being pulled down as I am being pushed.
There are a lot of misconceptions about gravity, so let's get into it, starting with the difference between gravity and microgravity.
Gravity, you can think about it as like the force that's sticking everything to our planet. And if you talk about it in the physics sense, it's actually one of the very weak forces in the universe. But for us on Earth, we don't notice it. We don't think about it, that when you have something in your hand and you drop it, it falls. But that's gravity right there. Newton and the apple is the apocryphal story.
Look, Isaac, the apple way up there on the tree. It looks as if it's right next to the moon.
Anything not being supported has to come down. The apple fell on me.
But it controls everything in terms of like how we're kind of stuck to the planet. And so the difference between gravity and microgravity is in microgravity, you don't have any of those forces pulling you downwards or pulling you onto everything. So that's why everything in the space station is floating.
People tend to think astronauts experience zero gravity in space, but that's not true. Zero G is more of a sci-fi concept. It's not a phrase that NASA uses to describe the environment on the ISS.
Everybody, I think, colloquially uses the term zero gravity. Of course, as a scientist, we want to get very precise about things. And so zero gravity means no gravity whatsoever. And they're very small, but there are measurable gravitational effects on the space station. And so essentially, the space station has this simulation of microgravity because we've launched into space. We're going 17,500 miles an hour around the Earth in an orbit. So we're essentially falling around the Earth the whole time. And that's why everything floats up. It's like we're in free fall. Like, the whole space station has been dumped off the top of a building and we're all falling constantly. But because there are measurable gravitation effects, we call it microgravity. We mean a very small amount of gravity. And for most experiments that biologists are going to do, it's just completely negligible.
Okay, real talk. I remember being super confused by this the first time I heard it. So let's break it down together. The ISS is located about 250 miles above Earth's surface, and because of our girl gravity, the spacecraft is constantly being pulled down to the ground. But it's moving so fast that instead of crashing into Earth's surface, it sails right by it. Humor me with a simple exercise. Draw a circle on a piece of paper. Now place your finger 3 or 4 inches outside the circle. Move your finger 1 inch closer to the circle to resemble gravity. Now 1 inch sideways to represent the spacecraft's speed. Keep making this staircase motion, and you will hopefully see that your finger never intersects with the circle. Instead, you will continuously orbit the circle, just like our ISS does with Earth. Pretty neat, right?
You know, microgravity is just this like technical NASA term. You can think of it as 0G, just being a little bit more precise and accurate about that.
So if you're on a spacewalk, what would you say there? Is there microgravity there?
It is, because even though you're outside the space station at that point, you're still falling around space. What we do notice that's interesting on a spacewalk is even though you don't have gravity and you don't feel the weight of yourself or the spacesuit, you still have mass. And the spacesuit's huge. So you plus the spacesuit can be 300 plus pounds. And so when you're moving along on a spacewalk hand over hand, if you put too much force in, you can actually you really could launch yourself off the side of the space station. You have to be very careful about this. It's like we learn all these things in high school physics class, but you get to experience, just all of these Newtonian laws of physics. You experience it in a different way.
By not touching the dirty dishes, I'm continuing to prove Newton's first law of motion. An object at rest will remain an object at rest unless acted upon by an unbalanced force.
You learn things like every action has an equal and opposite reaction. When you're typing on a keyboard in space, if you're not secured, the second you type your first letter, you're very slowly going towards the ceiling because you put a little force into your keyboard. So we hook our feet under something and we kind of use our toes to offset that force.
Does it ever become second nature?
I think it takes the average astronaut maybe about a week before they're kind of proficient in these space skills. Because the other thing is we don't walk around, right? If you want to get from place to place, you have to fly like Superman. And so that involves pushing off something, but making sure that you haven't pushed off with the direction going up or going down, because you're just going to go and nothing is going to stop you. You're in this kind of frictionless environment. And if you're going up or down, you're going to impact the hatch with your forehead. So it starts to be this really quick self-correcting mechanism. Everybody kind of walks around with a little bruise on their forehead for the first 3 days of space. But then there's another period of really deep learning and deep adaptation that takes place about 6 weeks into it, where all of a sudden, now you become very accustomed to working upside down. You don't have this absolute reliance on my head must be up and my feet must be down. So on the space station, it's like a ship and we label everything deck and overhead just because we found that psychologically humans need an up or a down, even if there is not one in space. We need to come up with an up or down in all the different modules, because if you went to one module or the other and they had different ups or downs, everybody would drive themselves crazy. So kind of make this fake up and down is pointing towards the earth and up is your head pointing out towards the universe. But then you learn how to operate upside down. You learn how to crawl around on the walls and you don't notice it very much. And that starts developing around a month or 6 weeks where you feel just completely at home in this new habitat where it seems like all the laws of physics are amplified. And that doesn't go away. I noticed on my second space flight, I got back up there and within an hour, I was just in it again. It is like riding a bicycle.
When you actually docked and you're experiencing microgravity for the first time, was it anything like what you felt during your training on Earth?
Maybe the closest thing you can come is floating in a pool, but in a pool, you're surrounded by all that water. So you got the hydrostatic pressure, and it's even harder to move underwater than it is in air. And so when you get to the space station, you feel like you're floating in a pool, but all of a sudden there's nothing. You put in a little bit of force and you're just banging into the hatch. So you feel, I would say, out of control. You feel sort of like you're tumbling around. And that's that week-long process to get your body to go where it wants to and function how you want it to in a completely different environment.
I want to know about the first time it happened. What was going through your mind then? What were you thinking about?
You're mostly trying to not embarrass yourself on camera because you film the hatch opening and you don't know how to float at that point. But secondarily, it's after all of that kind of excitement and the press conference, and you get to talk to your family. It's really when you have a quiet moment to yourself and you can float over. We've got this great cupola where you've got windows down on Earth and you can take a look at the planet and just, really see the planet from space. That's when it hits you where you are and what a unique, incredible experience it is. I don't know that I was prepared for that. I mean, you can go online and you can watch the space station fly over things, 24 hours a day. So we watch a lot of that because it's pretty cool. And I was like, oh, this is what it'll look like. But it's a completely different experience being there in 3 dimensions and having that sense of distance versus watching it on the screen. It looks so big, but then at the same time you look out at the universe and you're like, wow, this is a really tiny planet actually that all these human beings are on, and the atmosphere is super thin, and like I was like scared for everybody on Earth. I'm like, oh no, like they don't have enough atmosphere. Like it's really fragile. It's called the overview effect. And a lot of astronauts experience this, like how fragile it's just this, like it's an eggshell on an egg of an atmosphere that we have. And that's what's keeping us alive. Looking back at Spaceship Earth is everybody just, you don't know the word to describe it.
The second time Kate left Earth's precious atmosphere, she happened to take off on her 42nd birthday.
Seconds, the parameters of the rocket are not wrong.
Oh yeah, happy birthday, Kate. Happy birthday. You had a big candle, that's right.
And Kate, I would like to join in and say happy birthday. To you, it's a beautiful day, and you celebrated it wonderfully.
It's got to be a wild feeling thinking that while you're in the space station, you don't get to experience rain or wind or anything like that. It's very interesting to have that dichotomy. How did that feel for you?
Yeah, it's not something that the people necessarily think about, but being isolated from the elements, you're living in something completely artificial. So you're living in this metal tube every single day. And some of the things that we've been thinking about are, how can we help humans adapt to that better? And I think most astronauts, we're screened for claustrophobia. We're screened to get along with people. People don't have a problem. Like you don't feel trapped and have a freak out at month 3. But our brains do need a diversity of experience. And so there's a lot of sensory deprivation in space. You have a lack of seeing anything new. You don't get to see nature, which is that's the biggest thing for everybody.
Since space is so desolate, NASA has a few ideas for how people can cope, like using essential oils that smell like pine trees, or even having nature scenes of forests and waterfalls just to look at.
What do you do to create that sensory experience when people are living in an artificial environment for so long? And for us on ISS, looking down on Earth gives you a lot of that. You're not necessarily seeing the trees, but you are seeing things change every day, and our planet is so beautiful and it changes during the seasons. But I think figuring out how to make the interior of the space station a little bit better in terms of sensory perception is going to help us for these really long duration missions like Mars.
That's right. These long microgravity excursions are part of a bigger mission. Eventually, NASA wants humans to explore our neighboring planets, like Mars.
We come in peace. We come in peace. We come in peace.
I cannot imagine what our astronauts will be thinking when they finally pack up for their expedition to the Red Planet. Y'all, it takes 9 months just to get to Mars. Then they have to wait a few months until the orbits sync up before they can even attempt to take the 9-month journey back. We're talking 1 to 3 years off planet Earth. And before they can even think about sending an astronaut to Mars, NASA must determine how much microgravity the human body can handle and for how long. In 2020, NASA announced that Kate Rubins, along with 17 other astronauts, had been selected for their first Artemis team. One of the goals of the Artemis program is to put the first woman and the first person of color on the moon. But more importantly, by 2028, they're going to set up a permanent presence by building humanity's first lunar space station. This spacecraft is called the Gateway, and it's an international collaboration with commercial partners. If everything goes according to plan, astronauts will live on the moon, do science experiments on the moon, and learn enough about the environment that we can get one step closer to sending humans to Mars. But their Moon to Mars program is easier said than done.
There's some things that you just take for granted when you have gravity about setting up science experiments.
Not only did Kate have to learn the exact procedure that scientists use here on Earth, but she also needed to determine an equivalent protocol for replicating it on the ISS in microgravity without losing any scientific rigor.
How is your lab setup going to be completely different when you can't put everything on the lab bench and it just starts floating up?
As a chemist that frequently works with lots of scary liquids, this question gives me so much anxiety. It's hard to imagine my lab in space. For astronauts hundreds of miles away.
There are some other fun things that we've discovered later on, like if you're at the lab bench on Earth and you want to eject your pipette tip, you just click it into a bin of used pipette tips. But in space, all that stuff's going to float up. So we tried pulling off each tip individually and putting it in a Ziploc bag. The problem is when you put things in the Ziploc bag, they float too. And so when you try to put the new pipette tip in, everything else comes out. And then you're like flying around space station trying to like chase pipette tips so that it doesn't, go fly into somebody's crew quarters. It was just a hot mess for a little while with pipetting in space.
Eventually, they found a medical sharps container that could contain the pipette tips. But this example is just one of many challenges that arises when trying to do science, or anything really, in an environment with microgravity.
Houston, we have a problem.
To figure out if humans can really survive long periods of time in space, Kate championed the Cardinal Heart Experiment, a study that investigated what happens to engineered human heart tissue when it undergoes changes in gravitational force. As expected, they were able to confirm that microgravity causes pretty significant damage to heart cell function and gene expression.
The Cardinal Heart was sort of an attempt to learn about what's going on with the heart, what's going on with the heart tissue at a very fundamental scientific level. So we're approaching it from the ground up, like the cells in a petri dish kind of biological level.
In the follow-up experiment, aptly named Cardinal Heart 2.0, Kate's colleagues tested the effects of pharmaceutical drugs on an engineered beating heart. Their goal was to minimize, or ultimately eliminate, the adverse health effects that Kate and her team discovered in the first experiment. We're still awaiting the results of this study, but don't worry, I'll be sure to keep y'all updated when NASA publishes their data.
For long-term effects, the big things that we're concerned about is bone loss, muscle loss, definitely the cardiovascular effects, vision effects on your immune system. And so NASA categorizes all of these as risks, and we track these risks. And so a lot of the research that we're doing is trying to buy down that risk. We're trying to learn things scientifically that will help us maybe develop a countermeasure that helps the astronauts stay healthy. I did some experiments where we actually got to ultrasound our own hearts. And so we've got a remote guider on the ground because, we're not ultrasound experts. We learn a little bit, but this is a skill that takes a long time to develop. And so they tell us how to point this thing, and we actually image our own hearts. And so we can do things like look at blood flow through the valves. We can also look at things like arterial stiffness. There's some thoughts that maybe our vascular system is having some effects.
One of the things Kate and her team learned is that space affects our blood flow. She found that astronauts either have stagnant or sometimes even reversed blood flow.
I think there's a lot of things that we're still learning about humans in space. Our bodies have evolved with this constant downward force, right? And so our vascular system has evolved all these cool little pumps that start pumping the blood back up. And this maintains your blood pressure and everything. But when you take out the downward force side of that equation, you get all the fluid shifts towards your head. We can see even just our faces get puffy, because all the fluid gets up there. You kind of have a stuffy nose the whole time that you're in space.
There's a name for this phenomenon, puffy face and bird legs, because the liquid in astronauts' legs travel up to their heads, causing their cheeks to swell and their legs to shrink. And even though they can track these changes with ultrasounds, for some of the more technical experiments, NASA is going to need to send an MD to space.
We haven't done a lot of studies on cerebral spinal fluid because that involves things like spinal taps and is a lot harder to do than an ultrasound. but your cerebrospinal fluid may be affected. I'm super interested in the immune system and a phenomenon called viral reactivation, where, normally healthy people in their 30s and 40s don't get shingles, but we've had astronauts get shingles on board because the immune system's not working as well in space. And so these dormant viruses could come out. And so we've got a huge research program at Johnson Space Center that's looking at all of these things and trying to figure out how we have humans live longer in space in microgravity. What's going to change when we go to the moon and all of a sudden we have 1/6G?
1/6G is astronaut talk for the moon's gravity being 1/6 of Earth's gravity.
What's going to change when we're talking 2.5 years missions to Mars? And how might those effects, do they kind of top out? Or like we know with bone loss, you're going to keep losing bone. And so we have to develop countermeasures against that.
Kate confirmed that there are also a lot of other long-term health effects that astronauts experience, like muscle atrophy, a loss of bone density, and vision impairment. To prevent too much muscle atrophy, the astronauts are required to work out 2.5 hours a day. They run on the treadmills and lift weights to focus on endurance and resistance training. They also take medication and supplement their diet with calcium and vitamin D to fend off bone loss. And due to the fluid rushing to their heads, 70% of astronauts experience SANS, spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. The increased pressure on their eyes, brain, and blood vessels can create problems for their vision. And I was saddened to learn that sometimes this damage is permanent. On the other hand, the puffy face and bird legs condition is quickly reversed upon returning back to gravity. But
it's not fun coming home.
Emotionally, mentally, physically, it's like they gained superpowers while orbiting the planet. But then, almost in an instant, they lost their ability to fly forever.
Actually, I think, for anybody who wants to apply to be an astronaut out there, I do need to tell you, it really sucks coming back to the Earth.
Bob Hines, a NASA astronaut that spent 170 days in space, described the feeling of re-experiencing gravity as clumsy. He remembers picking up his foot to step forward, and then because his muscles were used to taking it easy in space, they would instinctively relax, aka forget about gravity, and his foot would then slam into the ground like he was flopping around while just trying to walk. If I'm being real with y'all, the transition back to Earth's gravity is what scares me the most. If someone dedicates years of their life investigating Mars, living entirely in microgravity, what's going to happen to their body when they finally land back on Earth and experience gravity for the first time in years?
I know that people talked about how hard it was to come home. So you have this period of adaptation on board, where you got to learn to ambulate, right? You got to learn to float and how to do everything in your life. And your brain starts building all these neural pathways. But as part of that, you start ignoring the things that you don't need, which is this perception of gravity. Your bones and your muscles don't need to be weight bearing anymore. And so your body's, use it or lose it. It costs glucose to maintain everything. And so our bodies, if we don't do something about it, they're going to start shedding muscle and bone. We start shedding our ability to navigate, our proprioception. And so when you come back, all of a sudden you're hit with all this stuff. And it's harder coming back because now you feel gravity. There was a fun experiment that I did that was looking at astronauts' reactions after you got back to gravity. Like if we go to Mars, how well are we going to be able to get out and do a spacewalk right away if it's an emergency? And so one of them is you lay face down on the ground and they say, how much do you weigh right now? And I was like, I weigh at least 250, maybe 300 pounds. I felt like I was stuck to the earth by magnets because my body hadn't experienced gravity. So if you think about like, gosh, what would it feel like if we landed on Jupiter? Or maybe anybody's been at the county fair and done one of those like gravitron things where you're like stuck to the walls. It feels like that. Like it's hard to raise your arm. And so, yeah, I came back the first time and I was like, yeah, I don't know if this was in the consent form that I signed in space, but it was great because on my first flight, I was blissfully ignorant. The problem is your second flight, then you're getting ready to undock and I'm like, oh man, I know it's coming. It's going to get me. The gravity, it's real tough, man.
Do you think there's ever a chance, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, is there ever a chance that a human being could be born in an environment and live their entire life in just microgravity? Is that a possibility, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of ethical considerations right now. Like we don't know enough about fetal development. if people are talking about really building civilizations and habitation, we're thinking about things like Mars or the lunar surface, so they at least have some gravity. But, what we've learned so far is that humans are able to adapt to space pretty well. And so I think that there's not something that would absolutely prevent development in space. The question is, would that human be suited only for space? Like, could they come back to Earth? After 6 months in space, I was incredibly maladapted to this planet. I was dropping stuff. I couldn't jump off a 6-inch box because I didn't have my proprioceptive skills, right? And that all comes back. But if your only development process is in space, it would have to be an era where we had a really good understanding of physiology, and we would have all these medical countermeasures so that we weren't putting the human safety or the human life at risk. We have seen the fact that we didn't evolve in microgravity and we can send people there, and for the most part they're fine. There's systems that are affected, but it's not incompatible with human life.
So if we could turn gravity off on Earth for 10 minutes, what would you want to watch people experience for the first time, assuming it could be done safely somehow?
I really want to see people float and try to stabilize themselves and get from point A to point B. If you get a rookie astronaut on board space station, the veteran astronauts will kind of before anybody gets up there, you tack down all the computers on the wall, you wrap up the cables nicely, you batten down the hatches, you secure everything. Because when you don't know how to float, it's like Pigpen, the Peanuts character. There's just a kind of a debris cloud that follows you because you're knocking stuff off the walls. And so I think it'd be really fun for people to just, experience that kind of sensation of floating.
All I can picture is just childproofing a house. Like you're preparing for a toddler to just come and destroy everything.
We do astronaut proof the space station.
I wish we could do that in the chemistry lab. Just rope off the dangerous sections when the new hires arrive. Y'all, the amount of glassware I broke in my first week of lab was unreal. But now that I'm thinking about it, every single one of my accidents was due to gravity. So maybe chemistry would be easier in space.
Okay, if we had a little more titanium nitrate and just a tad of chlorophyll tartrate, ovenless brownies!
Maybe not. We need gravity at some point in our lives, right? So this is yes or no only, if possible. Would you ever want to live in a universe that does not have gravity?
No.
Why? I know I said yes or no, but why?
I think that having the opportunity to go visit somewhere that doesn't have gravity is really cool, but life is hard without gravity. You got to think a lot harder about everything. You lose stuff all the time. If you haven't consciously stuck something down somewhere, gravity is really helpful. If you watch astronauts floating around on board, sometimes we're doing this and we're looking around that's because we've just lost something and we're trying to figure out where it floated. We learn how to live with it, but it makes everyday activities really challenging. So it's cool that we have a place and we can go to that for 6 months, or a year, and we can do all this amazing science. But it's a lot easier having gravity and having an atmosphere, just having running water, all these amazing things. Gravity, I hated it when I got back to the planet, but we've gotten to a good place now. We have a good relationship at this point.
So do you miss it? Do you miss the ISS?
Yeah, there's the astronaut paradox that when you're on Earth, you miss being in space, and when you're in space, you miss being on Earth. It was such an incredible experience for me, just, to be able to look down on the planet, to be doing, we did over 200 different scientific experiments during my mission, and to do spacewalks. I did 4 spacewalks to get a chance to go outside the space station. It's one of the most challenging things we do. So I definitely miss it, but I'm also pretty grateful for life on the planet.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been so much fun. My face actually hurts because I've been smiling this entire time.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. And I hope it was fun for your listeners to hear a little bit about space and just the wonderful world of science and how cool it is and how lucky we are to be scientists and get to wake up and investigate this stuff every day.
Cheers to that. Kate and her colleagues' research will, without a doubt, make it possible for human beings to stand on Mars one day. Will we be alive to see it? I'm not so sure, but Kate is confident that it will happen in the next 20-ish years. All right, friends, that's it for now. But I would just like to point out that I did an entire podcast on gravity, and not once did I say anything negative about the science in the movie Gravity.
Why we enjoy a sci-fi film set in make-believe space more than we enjoy actual people set in real space.
If you want to follow Kate and her colleagues' progress and keep up with NASA's out-of-this-world science experiments, check out their live streams at plus.nasa.gov. Thank you so much for listening to Seeking a Scientist, and special thanks to everyone who's been writing reviews and sharing this podcast with their friends. It really does help us celebrate badass scientists like astronaut Kate and get them that standing ovation they so deserve. Also, we're going to try something new. We're highlighting the biggest science revelations of 2024 and answering your end-of-the-year science questions. What's something you've always wanted to understand, but struggle to wrap your mind around? Is there a scientist in your community that deserves a shout out? No questions or topics are off limits. This is our holiday gift to you. Send me your questions and thoughts via email to kate@seekingascientist.org and a gold star for those of you who send a voice memo. Remember, I'll need your submissions by December 1st if you want to be featured on an upcoming episode of Seeking a Scientist. Seeking a Scientist is a production of KCUR Studios in Kansas City, made possible with support from the Stowers Institute for Medical Research, where scientists work to accelerate our understanding of human health and disease. It's hosted by me, Dr. Kate Bieberdorf, aka Kate the Chemist. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Kate the Chemist, or the pod at Seeking a Sci Pod. Our senior producer is Suzanne Hogan, our editor is Mackenzie Martin, and our digital editor is Gabe Rosenberg. This episode was mixed by Suzanne Hogan, and a huge thank you to David McKeel, who talked to y'all on the street. Special thanks as always to the team at KCUR Studios, Olivia Hewitt, Byron Love, and Genevieve DesMarteau. You heard clips this episode from freesound.org, Associated Press, NASA, Gravity, Interstellar, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, Friends, Once Upon a Time Discoverers, The Who Was Show, Isaac Newton's Roommate, America's Space, Mars Attacks, Apollo 13, Rick and Morty, and Cinema Sins, Everything Wrong with Gravity with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Our original theme music is by The Coma Calling, and you heard additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay nerdy, my friends.